Morning light settles through the broken windows of a requisitioned school building. Dust hangs in the air, unmoving. Along one wall, a line of Japanese women stand at attention. Their uniforms are neat but worn. Rank insignia carefully pinned. Some are officers, trained in administration, communications, medical command. All have been taught the same final lesson. Defeat brings disgrace. Capture brings cruelty. Outside, boots approach. Not running, not shouted, just measured footsteps on stone. The women do not look up. They have memorized the stories. The enemy humiliates. The enemy punishes. The enemy takes revenge. An interpreter steps forward first. Then American officers follow, unarmed, deliberate, their posture formal but restrained. No weapons raised. No bark commands. The room remains quiet. And then something unexpected happens. Words are spoken. Calm words. Respectful words. Words acknowledging duty, endurance, survival. No accusations. No threats. Only an unfamiliar tone. One that does not fit the war they were prepared to face. In that still room, something begins to shift. Not territory, not power, but belief itself. And to understand why those words carried such weight, we must step back into the world that shaped these women, and a war that taught them what to expect. By the time the Pacific War entered its final phase, Imperial Japan had mobilized nearly every layer of its society. Total war demanded total participation. Men filled the ranks of the army and navy. Women, long framed by the state as guardians of home and morality, were drawn steadily into formal military structures, not as combat troops, but as essential officers within the machinery of war. From the late 1930s onward, Japanese women served in organized roles that carried rank, authority, and responsibility. Military nurses operated under army command, often holding officer status. Communications units employed women trained in radio operation, code handling, and clerical intelligence work. Civil defense organizations placed women in supervisory roles, coordinating evacuations, air raid response, rationing, and factory discipline. In administrative offices across the home islands and occupied territories, women officers ensured the daily functioning of a state at war. Their training was not casual. It was ideological. Imperial doctrine emphasized absolute loyalty to the emperor, endurance without complaint, and the belief that surrender was worse than death. From early instruction manuals to wartime lectures, women officers were taught that capture by the enemy meant humiliation, abuse, and moral annihilation. These beliefs were not abstract fears. They were reinforced by propaganda, battlefield reports, and carefully curated atrocity stories circulated by the state. American forces, in particular, were portrayed as brutal and racially contemptuous. Military education materials warned that Western soldiers lacked honor, discipline, and restraint. For women, the warnings were explicit. Contact with the enemy was described as a threat not only to life, but to personal and national purity. To survive defeat, they were told, was to fail. This indoctrination was not limited to fringe units. By 1944, it had reached nearly every auxiliary and officer training program available to women. Even those serving far from the front understood their role as part of a sacred national struggle. Obedience was survival. Silence was strength. As the war situation deteriorated, these expectations hardened. The closer defeat came, the more absolute the teachings became. Civil defense manuals instructed women officers to maintain order even as cities burned. Nursing directives emphasized service until physical collapse. Administrative officers were told to destroy records, deny information, and prepare for the possibility of death rather than submission. By mid-1945, many women officers had already lived through firebombing campaigns that erased entire neighborhoods overnight. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of regional cities lay charred and silent. Supply systems collapsed. Medical facilities overflowed. Yet official language remained rigid. The war was not lost. The spirit endured. Inside this environment, Japanese women officers learned to suppress fear, to accept inevitability, to expect the worst. They were not passive victims of the system, but neither were they free agents. Their authority existed inside strict boundaries defined by a militarized patriarchy. Rank did not equal autonomy. It meant responsibility without escape, orders without negotiation, duty without reassurance. So when Japan's leadership spoke of final resistance, of national extinction rather than surrender, these women listened. Many believed they would never see an enemy face to face. Others believed that if they did, it would be the last moment of their lives. By August 1945, they were still standing at attention, still in uniform, still waiting for a fate they thought they understood. But beyond their training rooms and burned-out offices, the world was already shifting, faster than doctrine could follow. By late 1944, the foundations of Imperial Japan's war effort were breaking apart under pressures no amount of discipline could reverse. The strategic situation had turned decisively. American forces, having secured island chains across the Central and Southwest Pacific, were now operating within direct, striking distance of the Japanese home islands. The loss of Saipan in July 1944 was especially catastrophic. It placed U.S. bombers within range of Japan itself and shattered the illusion that the war could be contained at the perimeter. From that point forward, the conflict moved inward, into cities, factories, hospitals, and homes. The American strategic bombing campaign intensified rapidly. B-29 superfortresses began systematic raids against industrial targets and then against urban centers. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, killed an estimated 100,000 civilians in a single operation. Entire districts vanished in hours. Similar raids followed across Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller cities. Infrastructure collapsed. Transportation halted. Food distribution faltered. Women officers were not insulated from this destruction. Many were stationed in urban administrative hubs or medical facilities that became direct targets. Nursing officers worked through nights illuminated by burning neighborhoods. Civil defense supervisors coordinated evacuations that often led nowhere. Communications officers relayed orders that no longer matched reality on the ground. Yet publicly, the state maintained its language of resolve. Official broadcasts spoke of sacrifice and endurance. Military bulletins emphasized enemy losses while obscuring Japan's own. The emperor remained distant, symbolic, untouchable. 4 women officers trained to equate obedience with survival. Contradiction between experience and instruction created a growing internal strain. Then, in August 1945, events accelerated beyond precedent. On August 6th, an atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The scale and nature of these attacks were unlike anything the world had seen. Information was initially fragmented. Many officers learned of the destruction only through rumors or incomplete reports. What they did understand was that entire cities had ceased to function in an instant. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive offensive into Manchuria. For the Japanese High Command, this removed any remaining strategic hope. The empire now faced annihilation from multiple directions, with no realistic path to negotiation on favorable terms. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio. His voice, unfamiliar to most of his subjects, announced Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. The language was formal, indirect, and carefully restrained. Surrender was not named outright, but its meaning was unmistakable. Across Japan, confusion followed. Some units refused to believe the war was over. Others awaited written confirmation. Women officers, bound to chain-of-command discipline, remained at their posts. Records were sealed, equipment inventoried, uniforms maintained. And then came the occupiers. In the weeks following the announcement, American forces landed not as conquering armies in battle, but as administrators enforcing surrender terms. Their orders were explicit: maintain discipline, prevent reprisals, respect civilians, secure compliance without provoking resistance. 4 Japanese women officers. This was the moment their training had prepared them for and feared. They expected interrogation, arrest, humiliation, violence. Instead, what approached them was something entirely different. And it would be in these first controlled encounters, quiet rooms, translators present, weapons lowered, that the war's most deeply held assumptions would begin to collapse. When American forces began their initial occupation procedures, Japanese women officers did not meet them as individuals. They met them as symbols, embodiments of everything they had been warned against. Years of training had reduced the enemy to a single expectation: cruelty followed by erasure. Even in surrender, fear was not chaotic. It was organized, disciplined, and quiet. Many women officers recorded later that they had prepared themselves mentally for arrest or death. Some believed they would be publicly shamed. Others expected immediate confinement. Silence, they believed, would be their final duty. To speak was unnecessary. To resist was pointless. To hope was dangerous. Their posture in those early encounters reflected this internal state. Back straight, eyes lowered, hands still, not from defiance, but from conditioning. They were trained to receive orders, not explanations. Imperial Japan's honor culture framed war as a moral trial rather than a strategic contest. Victory affirmed virtue. Defeat signaled moral failure. For women officers, this framework carried additional weight. Their service was meant to support men at the front and preserve national integrity at home. Survival under enemy control was portrayed as betrayal of family, emperor, and self. Surrender, in this context, was not simply the end of fighting. It was an identity collapse. The state had invested heavily in reinforcing this belief. Wartime films, lectures, and official publications depicted capture as a fate worse than death. The message was consistent. The enemy did not respect Japanese honor and therefore would not respect Japanese lives. This worldview left little room for nuance. The possibility of humane treatment was not considered strategically useful, so it was excluded from doctrine. Despite holding rank, Japanese women officers existed within rigid hierarchies. Their authority was functional, not symbolic. They managed logistics, care, and coordination, but decision-making remained male-dominated. As defeat approached, this imbalance deepened. Women were expected to maintain order even as senior male leadership withdrew or went silent. In this vacuum, women officers became the visible face of institutional continuity. They kept offices running, maintained records, oversaw remaining personnel. Their presence signaled that the state still existed, even if its power no longer did. This made their first contact with American officers especially significant. They were not civilians pleading for mercy. They were representatives of a defeated system, trained to expect judgment. Instead, what they encountered was restraint. And that restraint, quiet and procedural, created a psychological tension far more disorienting than violence would have been. Because if the enemy did not behave as expected, then the war itself had been misunderstood. And that realization was only beginning to take shape. The conduct Japanese women officers encountered in late 1945 was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate policies shaped months before occupation forces ever set foot on the home islands. Under Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur, American troops were issued clear directives. The occupation was to be firm, controlled, and non-punitive. Disorder was the enemy. Revenge was forbidden. U.S. soldiers were instructed to treat Japanese personnel, military and civilian alike, with restraint. Weapons were to be visible, but unused. Interactions were to be procedural, not emotional. Respect for rank, even in surrender, was emphasized as a stabilizing tool. This approach served strategic goals. A humiliated population could resist. A frightened one could panic. But a population treated with discipline and predictability might comply. For Japanese women officers, this policy manifested in small but startling ways. Meetings were scheduled, not forced. Translators were used carefully. Questions were factual, not accusatory. In many cases, American officers acknowledged the roles these women had performed, nursing, administration, civil defense, as legitimate service rather than criminal participation. No one raised their voice. No one struck a desk. No one threatened. This calm, methodical behavior contradicted everything Japanese military doctrine had taught them to expect. Psychological angle. The shock that followed was not dramatic. There were no public breakdowns, no visible collapse. Instead, there was a quiet destabilization, a moment when certainty drained away. Fear had been manageable because it was familiar. It followed a script, but restraint had no script. For women officers who had prepared themselves for cruelty, kindness, or even neutrality, created cognitive dissonance. If the enemy did not act like an enemy, then the moral framework of the war no longer held. Some later described feeling disoriented rather than relieved. Others reported a sense of embarrassment, not because they had been defeated, but because their expectations had been wrong. The enemy they feared did not exist in the form they had imagined. That realization carried weight. It challenged years of ideological conditioning in a matter of minutes. Enemy perspective angle. From the American side, these encounters were also instructive. U.S. officers were meeting individuals they had previously known only through intelligence reports and propaganda imagery. Japanese women officers did not match the caricatures of fanaticism often portrayed in wartime media. They were composed, efficient, exhausted. Reports sent up the occupation chain frequently noted the professionalism of Japanese administrative and medical personnel, including women officers. This reinforced the American decision to maintain existing civil structures wherever possible rather than dismantle them entirely. In this quiet exchange, respect met with disbelief. Both sides were learning something the battlefield could never teach. That the war's final turning point would not be marked by gunfire. It would be marked by words. And those words, spoken calmly across a table, would land with more force than any order ever had. The decisive encounters did not take place on beaches or airfields. They unfolded in offices, schools, hospitals, and municipal buildings that still smelled of smoke and disinfectant. Rooms where paperwork remained stacked neatly, even as the empire that created it had ceased to exist. Japanese women officers were summoned in groups or individually. Not dragged, not surrounded, simply informed, through interpreters, that their presence was required. Many arrived early. Uniforms pressed. Rank insignia aligned with care that bordered on ritual. If this was to be judgment, they would meet it correctly. American officers entered these spaces with visible restraint. Sidearms remained holstered. Helmets were often removed indoors. Seating was arranged. Translators positioned between parties, careful with phrasing, deliberate with tone. There was no immediate interrogation. Instead, procedures were explained. Identification was confirmed. Roles were clarified. Responsibilities during the final months of the war were documented. Nursing assignments, civil defense coordination, communications oversight, administrative logistics. These were not accusations. They were records. For many Japanese women officers, this alone was destabilizing. They had expected punishment for service. Instead, their service was being acknowledged as function. Then came the pause. In these early meetings, there was often a moment, unwritten, unplanned, when formal business slowed. Papers stopped moving. Pens rested. The interpreter waited. And it was in that space that something unfamiliar entered the room. American officers, following neither script nor propaganda, addressed the women directly. Not as criminals, not as enemies, but as professionals who had carried burdens in an unwinnable war. The words were simple, measured, intentionally unprovocative. They acknowledged endurance. They acknowledged loss. In some cases, they expressed regret that civilians and medical personnel in particular had suffered so heavily. They stated clearly and without threat that cooperation, not retribution, was the purpose of the occupation. For women trained to believe that surrender erased dignity, this was not relief. It was shock. There were no cheers, no visible reactions. Most remained silent, as discipline required. But internally, a fault line opened. If these men had the power to punish and chose not to, then power itself had changed meaning. In reports written later, several women officers described this moment as more unsettling than fear. Fear could be endured. This cannot be easily processed. Some noted their confusion at being thanked for maintaining hospitals, for keeping records, for preventing disorder during air raids. These were duties they had been told would condemn them in the eyes of the enemy. Instead, they were recognized as stabilizing actions that prevented further suffering. The encounter did not absolve the war. It did not erase responsibility, but it altered the emotional equation in a single stroke. The enemy had not arrived to destroy them. The enemy had arrived to end the war, and in doing so, had dismantled years of indoctrination with a handful of carefully chosen words. What followed, how those words were received, remembered, and recorded, would mark one of the quietest turning points of the entire conflict. The impact of those early encounters did not surface immediately. There were no outward displays. Japanese women officers remained composed, as training demanded. Meetings concluded with formal acknowledgments. Chairs were pushed back quietly. Papers were collected. Instructions were followed with precision. But the turning point had already occurred. In personal accounts written years later, memoirs, oral histories, post-war interviews, the same pattern appears. The moment that stayed with them was not a command. It was not a threat. It was a tone. Several women recalled being addressed through interpreters with language that emphasized cooperation rather than submission. Phrases that framed the occupation as a transition, not a reckoning. Statements that recognized exhaustion rather than guilt. In some cases, American officers explicitly stated that women serving in medical and administrative roles were not considered combatants, and that their work had saved lives. This distinction mattered deeply. Imperial doctrine had erased such nuance. Service was service. Defeat erased all honor. But here, in quiet rooms under fluorescent or natural light, distinctions were being restored. One recurring memory described by multiple women officers was the moment eye contact was met, not avoided. A nod of acknowledgement. A brief expression of respect. Small gestures, but they carried disproportionate weight. For some, this produced disbelief. For others, a delayed emotional response that arrived hours later, alone, when composure was no longer required. The realization was not that the enemy was kind. It was that the enemy was human. And humanity, once reintroduced, unraveled the narrative that had sustained the war. From the American side, reports emphasized calm compliance among Japanese administrative and medical personnel. Occupation officials noted that cooperation increased when interactions remained respectful. There was no evidence that humiliation was necessary to enforce surrender. In fact, restraint appeared to reduce resistance. These observations reinforced occupation policy and shaped subsequent encounters. Kindness, carefully controlled, became a tool of stabilization. For Japanese women officers, this marked the end of ideological isolation. The war had taught them that the outside world was hostile and immoral. These words suggested something else, that morality had not been destroyed by conflict, only obscured. The shift was not dramatic. It did not erase grief or responsibility, but it created space to think, to question, to exist beyond the rigid framework of honor and shame. By the time these women left those rooms, nothing about their circumstances had improved materially. Japan was still devastated. Food was scarce. Authority was gone. But the war, as they had understood it, was over. And in its place stood something quieter, more unsettling, and more enduring. The recognition that the enemy they had feared had spoken to them not with contempt, but with respect. That recognition would follow them into the uncertain months ahead, shaping choices, memories, and a long process of rebuilding. In the weeks that followed Japan's surrender, the routines of war gave way to the mechanics of occupation. For Japanese women officers, the transition was abrupt but orderly. Units were dissolved. Commands were reassigned. Records were reviewed, archived, or destroyed under Allied supervision. Uniforms that had once signified authority became reminders of a vanished structure. Yet the process unfolded without the reprisals many had expected. Women officers involved in nursing and medical administration were among the first to experience this shift. American occupation authorities, facing widespread disease, malnutrition, and injury, relied heavily on existing Japanese medical infrastructure. Hospitals reopened under joint oversight. Nursing officers were often asked, not forced, to remain temporarily in their roles, now serving civilian populations under new directives. This continuity mattered. It signaled that service had not become a liability overnight. Administrative and civil defense officers encountered similar treatment. Rather than sweeping purges, occupation officials prioritized functionality. Local governance, ration distribution, and public health required experienced personnel. Where no evidence of war crimes existed, many women officers were allowed to assist in transitional capacities before being formally released. For those expecting immediate detention, this approach was deeply disorienting. The occupation did not seek to erase their professional identities. It sought to repurpose them. Disarmament procedures were conducted with formality. Badges were surrendered. Files were cataloged. Final rosters were signed. The rituals of closure, though emotionally heavy, were handled with procedural respect. American officers rarely addressed individuals with contempt. Orders were given clearly, without spectacle. Psychologically, the impact unfolded unevenly. Some women officers felt a delayed collapse, an exhaustion that surfaced only when constant vigilance was no longer required. Others described an initial numbness, followed by guilt for having survived when so many had not. But threaded through these reactions was a recurring memory, the absence of cruelty. That absence reshaped how defeat was processed. The occupation also introduced new language, legal, administrative, and ethical, that reframed responsibility. Investigations focused on decision-makers and direct perpetrators, not on auxiliary service by default. This distinction, however imperfectly applied, allowed many women officers to separate personal duty from institutional failure for the first time. In daily life, conditions remained harsh. Cities were still ruined. Food shortages persisted, and in 1946, families searched for missing relatives. Women officers returned to homes that no longer existed or to communities that no longer recognized their former roles. But the fear that had once dominated their expectations, fear of humiliation, violence, and erasure, did not materialize. Instead, they entered a quieter struggle, learning how to exist without the rigid certainty the war had imposed. And as the months passed, the long-term consequences of those early words, spoken calmly in occupied rooms, began to surface in ways neither side had anticipated. As Japan moved through the first year of occupation, the experiences of women officers faded from public view, absorbed into a broader national effort to survive and rebuild. Yet privately, those encounters with American personnel remained vivid. They resurfaced in recollections shared years later, often not as dramatic turning points, but as moments that quietly redirected how defeat was understood. For many former women officers, the memory of respectful treatment complicated their sense of loss. The war had taught them that defeat meant moral annihilation. The occupation demonstrated that defeat could also mean transition. This realization did not erase grief or responsibility, but it softened the internal collapse they had been trained to expect. Some women went on to participate in early post-war reforms. Nursing officers became instructors in new civilian medical programs. Administrative officers found work in local government offices reorganized under democratic principles. Their wartime skills, once mobilized for imperial survival, were redirected toward civilian stability. The psychological impact was subtle but enduring. Former officers often spoke of a recalibration rather than a conversion. They did not suddenly embrace the occupier's worldview. Instead, they learned that the moral universe they had been confined to was incomplete. This shift appeared repeatedly in post-war testimonies. American soldiers were remembered less for authority than for tone. Respectful language, restraint, and predictability left stronger impressions than uniforms or weapons. In a society emerging from total war, these impressions mattered. From the American perspective, occupation reports increasingly emphasize the importance of maintaining dignity in defeat. Japanese compliance was higher where humiliation was absent. Cooperation flowed more readily when individuals felt seen rather than erased. These findings influenced later occupation policy not only in Japan, but in subsequent post-conflict administrations elsewhere. For Japanese women officers, the most profound consequence was internal. The war had demanded absolute loyalty and emotional suppression. Peace required something different: adaptation, ambiguity, and reflection. Many struggled with this transition. Some carried lifelong questions about complicity and responsibility. Others found quiet pride in having maintained care and order during chaos. But nearly all who later reflected on those first encounters returned to the same detail: the moment they realized the enemy was not what they had been taught. That realization did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with silence, a silence in which belief dissolved, and something more fragile, but more human, began to take its place. And in that silence, the meaning of the war itself began to change. Wars are often remembered for their violence, for the moments when power is enforced through destruction. But history is also shaped by quieter points of fracture, when certainty collapses without a single shot being fired. For Japanese women officers in 1945, the end of the war did not arrive as a dramatic confrontation. It arrived in rooms where voices were calm, where authority spoke without cruelty, where words replaced the brutality they had been taught to expect. In those moments, the rigid moral universe of total war began to dissolve. Imperial doctrine had prepared them for annihilation of dignity. Instead, they encountered restraint. That contrast did not absolve the war or erase its suffering, but it revealed something essential: that systems of violence depend as much on belief as on force. When belief collapses, power loses its sharpest edge. The American occupation succeeded not only because of military victory, but because it understood this distinction. By refusing humiliation, it denied defeated ideology the final validation it expected. Kindness, measured, disciplined, strategic, became a tool of stabilization more effective than punishment. For the women who stood at attention in those rooms, this was not a story of triumph. It was a reckoning. They had served faithfully within a system that promised honor and delivered ruin. The words they heard did not comfort them, but they freed them from a lie. History rarely records such moments in detail. They leave no ruins, no battle maps. Yet they alter lives in ways violence cannot. They open space for reflection, for responsibility, for rebuilding without myth. In the aftermath of the Pacific War, Japan's future will be shaped by constitutions, reforms, and global realignments. But for some, the war truly ended earlier, in a quiet exchange across a table, when the enemy spoke not in hatred, but in recognition. And in that recognition, the longest war, the one inside the human mind, finally began to fade.